beams are now trained on big European banks. Yesterday it was Moody's putting 3 top French banks under review for a possible downgrade. Today, the vice chair of the Swiss Central Bank said in a speech referring to his country's banks that it is crucial that a sufficient capital base be laid down as soon as possible so that losses can be fully absorbed. And Reuters has obtained testimony by the chair of the FDIC in the U.S., Sheila Bair. She said that it's troubling European banks, quote, continue to effectively set their own capital requirements using internal risk estimates, unconstrained by any objective hard limits. Bair said the prospects for further banking problems are unsettlingly high. All of this, of course, is tied to Greece, which is trying to avoid defaulting on its debt, and most of that debt is held by European banks. Joining us with more in studio in Toronto, Alex Dershevsky of Recovery Partners. He and his firm have advised governments during sovereign debt restructurings in the past. And Dan Alpert's in New York. He's managing partner at Westwood Capital. Welcome.
That default in certain of the sovereign debt issues are going to adversely affect the banks. I think that's an absolute certainty.
Alex?
Well, absolutely. Well, I thought we weren't supposed to worry about this. I thought the stress tests laid all these questions to rest. I mean, all the banks were well capitalized. We had the stress tests last summer. Obviously, somebody must have slipped up. But we
put enough stress assumptions.
Didn't put enough stress on the stress tests, But clearly, I agree with that. I mean, we're on the precipice here of what could be a potentially very large credit event in Europe.
And when you say a very large credit event, are you talking about a credit freeze-up like we saw a few years ago?
Well, that would be associated with this, but clearly there are now concerns about these banks. There are concerns about the governments. The debt loads on these governments is unsustainable. There are going to have to be some haircuts. It looks like the IMF has blinked, and now that the German approach is being looked at very seriously, the extend and pretend approach, the reprofiling approach, which the IMF insisted shouldn't go forward.
Extending maturities
on, basically forcing private sector lenders to accept different terms on their existing borrowings.
What's wrong with that, then?
Well, of course, it's a 4-part discussion, right? You've got the German view, let's just call that the austerity view. You've got the ECB's point of view. You've got the rating agencies, which, of course, if the rescheduling of the debt looks like it's anything other than consensual, and it smells to them at all as though a gun was put to people's head, they're going to put a sovereign default rating on these bonds, which is what sets in motion the panic or the fear that could spread to other peripheral countries in Europe. And then finally, the thing that nobody seems to ever talk about and should have been talking about yesterday is the man on the street. The truth is that with sovereign debt and with forced fiscal austerity on small countries, you do have to consider the notion of civic unrest. We did see that yesterday. We've seen it before. And there's nothing that the market abhors more than the notion of civic unrest. And so that's the big question mark. You can sit around and have an intellectual discussion about whether the Germans win or the IMF concedes or the ECB sort of does the European go-along, get-along thing, or whether or not the rating agencies will just, pinch their nose and swallow and sort of deal with it and not put a sovereign default rating on it. But if austerity is the answer here, and if it becomes too painful for the Greek people to swallow, you're going to see more of those Molotov cocktails lobbed at the Parliament building.
Well, exactly. That's the question mark here. I mean, nobody wants to become a tax slave, effectively, of the banks. You've had rolling protests in Spain now for over a month. People camped out all over the country. You've had protests in Greece. There's less than 40% popular support in the EU for these bailouts among taxpayers, in the rich countries even. So, that shouldn't be underestimated here in terms of its, input into the situation and the likely outcomes.
All right, I want to ask you, because yesterday you were on the phone to some key people in Greece. What was the vibe?
The vibe is extremely tense. I think the government is paralyzed in its decision-making capability. We're on the phone to some folks in the government, and you could hear the chanting and screaming of protesters outside the window in the room that they were sitting in. It's a very fraught atmosphere, and as you know, the government's now in a reshuffle mode.
Will that matter if they reshuffle?
Oh, they're going to reshuffle. They're going to get the money. They're not going to be pushed in default this time around, but clearly you can see that the wheels are coming off this process, as we've been saying all along. But the IMF, the ECB, the EU, and the PASOK, the ruling party in Greece, are trying to keep the process as it is on the rails. I don't think they'll be ultimately successful.
5 seconds left. Alex, are you worried about the interconnectedness of the European banks and North America?
No. I mean, I said this on a previous show. I agree totally with Dan. I think the contagion problem is as he's described, where you get other countries on a game theoretic basis. They get that, we should get this, and you get a cascading effect among all the countries that are indebted, needing to deal with the EU on their debt restructuring. And the EU, ECB, and IMF package then starts to unravel, and the prospect of haircuts has to be addressed.
Okay. We have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks to the two of you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
That's Dan Alpert with Westwood Capital in New York and Alex Trashevsky of Recovery Partners here in studio in Toronto. You're watching Headline on BNN.